morning. I'm Haya Ghazali, a freshman at Columbia University with the Columbia Political Review. I'm here interviewing Dr. Norman Finkelstein, a political scientist and author whose scholarship on the Israel-Palestine conflict has shaped critical debate for decades. For the past almost 15 months, he's been giving countless interviews, tirelessly analyzing developments in an ever-evolving situation. His books, The Holocaust Industry and Gaza, An Inquest into Martyrdom, are known for their rigorous examination of the archival records and international law, establishing him as a leading voice in discussions about justice and human rights. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start off with a little bit of a recent development. In November 2024, ICC prosecutor Khan obtained arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, assuming that they avoid scenarios where their arrest is possible. What significance does international law hold if enforcement is unlikely?
Well, that's always a good question. It's easy to become cynical and say, well, nothing is going to come of this, because we all know that at the end of the day, the U.S. is going to exercise its veto power, either privately, behind the scenes, or publicly at the UN, and bar any action. And there are all sorts of other recourses they have. They threaten that they won't let any ICC person, they've done this already, threaten they won't let any member of the International Criminal Court visit the United States if they pursue this path of prosecution. So I don't think one should focus on the practical ramifications, because I think they're probably close to zero. What's important is that all of these court victories, UN resolutions, the ICC, not the ICC, the ICJ hearings on genocide, what they do is they create their weapons. They're weapons in the ideological struggle. That's just a fancy way of saying, in order to win over people in a court of public opinion, you will be able to say that the International Court of Justice, assuming it does, and I think there's a reasonable probability, it decides that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Or most recently, the Amnesty International, it ruled that Israel is committing, not ruled, it researched and reached the conclusion that Israel is committing genocide. And then you're able to say, let's say you go on a program I've been on several times on Piers Morgan, and now I'll be able to say, well, this is not a war, this is a genocide. And they said, what do you mean? And Piers Morgan will say, well, it's disproportionate force. I said, no, it's not disproportionate force. It's a genocide. That's something very different. And if you have any argument about it, well, that's what Amnesty International said. That's what the International Court of Justice provisionally ruled, that it was plausibly a genocide. So these become important weapons in trying to persuade people, because at the end of the day, you're trying to do two things. At the end of the day, barring the fact that practical consequences are almost impossible, because the U.S. will block it, the Europeans will go along. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is two things. There was a great revolutionary, her name was Rosa Luxemburg, turn of the 20th century, one of the heroines of my youth, and she remains one to this day, and she will be one when I go to my grave. She said there are two jobs of radicals. Radicals have they have two jobs: educate and organize. Educate and organize. That's your job if you're a person of the left. Educate and organize. These victories, even though they are paper victories, they're very valuable victories. They help educate. You have respectable organizations which have a long track record of objectivity, conscientiousness, like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch. You have the International Court of Justice. The most distinguished legal minds in the world are assembled there. The International Criminal Court is more problematic, in my opinion, but we'll leave that aside. And so you have very reputable bodies and individuals who are saying it's a genocide. that persuades public opinion. That has a very big impact on public opinion when you're able to say that. And then the second thing is, as I said, at the end of the day, it's two things: educate and organize. And then you want to get people to do something about it. It's not enough to persuade them. You want them to act. So politics is about educating and organizing, and these are valuable weapons to educate. And then, educate is still one step removed from actually getting people to do something. You have in the United States, 80% of Americans support a single-payer system, what Bernie Sanders called Medicare for all. But then you have to organize that support, turn it into a weapon, a powerful political force, and that's hard. That's not easy. Just an aside note, Bernie Sanders was very excellent at understanding how to pitch a demand. How do you make a political demand? And what's very interesting, we're doing this interview right now with the killing of the CEO from United Healthcare, which incidentally is my my insurance. And there's been overwhelming, let's put it this way, overwhelming lack of sympathy for the CEO, and that told you, and it crosses the whole political spectrum. It tells you Bernie Sanders, he made, from 2016 and 2020, he made Medicare for all his signature demand. And it shows you how smart it was. Yeah. Because of that popular support out there for it, And it's the same thing in this struggle. You have to find the right slogans, the right demands, which means you have to have your pulse on the average American, And in this particular case, these kinds of victories, I think they resonate with the average American. You can win with them, in the public debate. So now if I go on Piers Morgan again, I'll be able to say, well, this is not my opinion. It's also the opinion of Amnesty International, which actually, I'll tell you, this last report they published, I finished it last night. It's 300 pages. It's very good. I was surprised at how high the quality was. And I consider that an important weapon. So now when you'll be able to say that Karim Khan issued the arrest warrants against Israel for war crimes, there was, I think, the crime against humanity of extermination. I think that's useful, even though Karim Khan is just horrible, absolutely horrible, and the likelihood of any follow-through is next to zero.
Well, you mentioned the U.S.'s support for Israel throughout this ruling. Why, and on that note, why is the U.S. so steadfast in its support for Israel, even as other countries are distancing themselves in response to international law and shifting public opinion?
This has been a long-standing matter of dispute among people trying to understand that relationship. I don't think one needs to be dogmatic about it. There are two basic approaches, you might say. One approach says it's the Israel lobby, and the other approach says it's U.S. foreign policy interests, that Israel serves U.S. foreign policy interests in the region. I think it's a combination of both. I think sometimes, let's say we take the current genocide in Gaza. There's no question in my mind that President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, they support Israel because Israel is a main bastion of U.S. power in the region. It's a projection of U.S. power. And there was a feeling after October 7th that U.S. power seemed weakened, that this ragtag army called Hamas was able to inflict a very serious blow to Israel's reputation. Remember, up to October 7th, the assumption was Israel had cutting-edge spy technology. Israel was this very formidable military power. And suddenly, after October 7th, it seemed like, wait, hold on. Maybe Israel isn't militarily invincible. Maybe there is a military option against Israel. And that was not just a concern of Israel, it was a concern of the U.S. because Israel's projection of invincibility serves U.S. interests in the region. It stabilizes the current configuration of power, where obviously the U.S. is the dominant force. So they had a role. The U.S. had an interest in stabilizing Israeli power, and obviously played a major role, enabled it. I mean, Israel couldn't have gone on one day, literally 1 hour, without U.S. support. In fact, one of the interesting things in the amnesty report, which I don't even think they noticed, is every time Israel relaxed the stringency of its genocide, if you read the report, every time it was U.S. pressure. So, for example, you will recall right after October 7th and October 9th, Defense Minister Gallant, he announced no food, fuel, water, or electricity will be admitted to Gaza. Well, that's a recipe for genocide. That's not complicated. If you have a hermetically sealed area and you're not allowing in any food, fuel, water, or electricity, it means it's a recipe for extermination. The U.S. said no. Now, the U.S. didn't say admit everything that's needed, but you can't go that far. And each step along the way, there are moments where Israel, let's take another example. You'll recall in April 2024, Israel killed the people from the, what was it called, World Central Kitchen? The folks in the World Central, bad PR, bad PR for the U.S. You're not supposed to kill World Central Kitchen. So Israel, the United States gave the order, you have to admit more food. You have to stop killing humanitarian workers. Israel did. It complied only for around 2 weeks, But every step of the way. So obviously, Israel can't breathe, not a breath, without the U.S. okay. It's on life support. Always, perpetually. It's going to say of perpetual life support, the U.S. has to give the green light for everything. So the U.S. saw that we have to restore what Israel calls its deterrence capability. Deterrence capability simply means, that's the fancy term Israel uses, the deterrence capability simply means the Arab world's fear of us. We have to restore the Arab world's fear of us. And the U.S. had an interest in that because the U.S. wants to maintain the current configuration of power in which it's dominant. On the other hand, there are moments where it's not the U.S., it's the Israel lobby. So let's take an obvious example, since you're from Colombia. There was no question why the repression set in at all the universities, why it was that 3 unprecedented in American history, there's nothing anywhere near it in American history, 3 Ivy League college presidents were toppled. Claudine Gay, McGill, and Shafiq. 3 Ivy League college presidents. And bear in mind, 2 of the 3 were women of color, which is a sacred category in our society right now, in the current woke culture. Women of color are sacrosanct. They were toppled without a whisper, nothing, nobody cared. Nobody cared. There was no expressions of outrage. And that was the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. That wasn't the U.S. government. People like Bill Ackman, Robert Kraft, Barry Sternlicht at Brown University, the alumni, who gave very large sums of money, they gave the order to the Board of Trustees. Either you repress these encampments or you're not getting our money. Now that was Jewish power. That wasn't, Biden or Blinken. It was Jewish supremacists, billionaires. And you had the case not just of them. You had the case of Sheryl Sandberg, the former COO of Meta, who put out that film, Screams Before Silence, claiming that there was she's also a billionaire, in that category, Jewish supremacist, put out these screams. It was just pure propaganda. It was like a Nazi propaganda film. There was no, as far as we know, we always have to enter the caveat, but if you go through the record very carefully, and I have, and it'll be the first chapter of a forthcoming book by me. I don't like to advertise it, but I don't have the evidence to present to you. I have the evidence in print. There's no evidence at all, none, that there was rape committed on October 7th. There's just none. But she decided to weigh in for the cause, contrive this propaganda film, Screams Before Silence. Again, that's not the U.S. government. That's the initiatives of the Jewish supremacist billionaire class.
So domestically, they have influence. But do you think that the U.S. support, in the sense that they have a strategic advantage in the Middle East, do you think that their support, both economically and politically, has become more of a burden?
No, I don't believe those things. Look, John Mearsheimer is a good friend of mine, just a really nice guy. And even though he's on the conservative end of the spectrum and on the radical end of the spectrum, we agree nowadays on, I don't even know there's much we disagree on. But the idea that Israel has, that's his book, The Lobby, written with Steve Waltz. Let's see if I have it over here. I'm sure I do, but there it is. It's like the fifth book. That's it.
This one?
Yeah. The idea that Israel has become a strategic burden, I don't agree with that at all. Look, Israel did a very fine job for the U.S. in the last year. Let's see what it's done. It annihilated Gaza. It inflicted a major blow to Hezbollah. It overthrew the Syrian government, or contributed to overthrowing the Syrian government. These are, fantastic victories for the U.S.
Absolutely.
Why would you call it a strategic burden?
Speaking of the fall of the Assad regime, how do you think that's going to influence broader regional dynamics?
I can't tell right now. Much too soon. I'm not an optimist. I don't want to be I don't want to pour cold water on the parade, but I'm old enough to remember Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Iraq. They all turned into disasters, and I think, my opinion, but I don't claim to any special knowledge, Syria is just going to disintegrate into armed groups like Libya and Iraq, each being financed by one of the regional or global powers. Turkey will have its surrogate. The U.S. will have its. Russia will have its, and it'll just be another disintegrated state. That's my opinion. Now, I could be wrong, but I see no grounds for optimism. The more you study these phenomena, the more you realize how important organization is. And the organized parties in Syria are not good. They're not good.
I want to backtrack a little bit to October 7, and you have likened the events of October 7 to the Nat Turner slave revolt, in the sense that both want to shatter the status quo, one against the illegal occupation of Gaza and the other against slavery. And so I wanted to kind of note that Hamas leaders also faced ICC arrest warrants. And with that in mind, what legal rights are available to Palestinians for resistance, and how effective are they?
In my opinion, you cannot address questions like October 7th in a void, some abstract principles of international law. One has to look at it concretely, and as in any situation, before you judge it, you have to ask yourself, what were the available options? I go through the record in the I've gone through the record in Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, but I go through the record again here in the new book, but in much more abbreviated form. Hamas did try diplomacy. It expressed a willingness. How far they would have gone, we don't know, but expressed a willingness to negotiate an end to the conflict with Israel on the basis of international law. Hamas did try international law. It cooperated with all of the UN commissions of inquiry which came to Gaza after Israel's periodic high-tech killing sprees there, cooperated with the Goldstone Report, cooperated with Amnesty International, cooperated with Human Rights Watch, hoping that something would come of these UN commissions of inquiry, some justice would be done to the people of Gaza. Well, that was a dead end. It tried nonviolent civil resistance, the Great March of Return in March 2018. What had happened? Well, Israel just systematically shot children, medics, journalists, disabled people, nonviolent persons, was systematically shooting them. When they didn't kill them, it aimed below the knee and below to inflict life-changing, what's called life-changing injuries. They had run out of options. I don't believe they had any options on October 7th. One could make arguments. Maybe they should have just targeted soldiers or combatants on October 7th. I find that argument very unpersuasive for a very simple reason. Hamas killed 300 combatants and more than 800 civilians. That's the number, okay? Let's do a hypothetical. Let's imagine that they had killed 1,200 combatants. Let's say they killed 1,200 combatants. Would that have lessened Israel's response? If they killed just soldiers, would that lessen their response? Can anyone possibly believe that Israel's response would have been less ferocious if they had only targeted combatants? I don't think so. I think actually Israel is a Spartan society. And in Spartan societies, they attach more value to a military life than to a civilian life, or a combatant to a civilian. I think the reaction would have been, if it were possible, which is not possible, it would have been more ferocious. So I don't think that would have made a difference. Now you can ask, well, how would international public opinion have reacted? How would other states have reacted? I don't think their reaction would have been any less if Hamas had targeted combatants. Now you could say, if Hamas had only targeted combatants. Now you could say, but what about the moral question? I don't know. What is striking, I've read several books now on the Nat Turner Rebellion. What's striking is Nat Turner's order when he launched the rebellion was, quote, kill all white people. There's no dispute about that. That was his order. And his Confederates, his fellow rebels, they disemboweled men. They hacked to pieces women. They did behead babies. Now, that didn't happen on October 7th, but it did happen in the Nat Turner Rebellion. And there are two things to be said about that. Number one, yes, white Americans were outraged. White Americans were outraged by what happened. African Americans, at that point slaves, they embraced Nat Turner. They embraced Nat Turner. And number two, whether you like it or not, and Nat Turner has now come to be regarded as a hero of the African American freedom struggle, notwithstanding the fact that if you look at the details of the rebellion, it was very brutal, to say the least.
So I just want to follow up a little bit on that. The leadership and the organization of both those events, of the Nat Turner slave revolt and October 7, what were the intentions of these? Did they expect good outcomes?
I'll tell you the truth, we really don't know. With Nat Turner, it's not clear. You could say he seems to have wanted to cause a national crisis in conveying the message that if you continue to treat us this way, this is going to be our reaction to it. Part of it was pure revenge. Part of it was pure revenge. And I think this, in the case of, and also in the case of Nat Turner, there were no options. If you didn't do something, it meant you would die a slave. And one of the things that touched me about the Nat Turner story is Nat Turner was a very smart guy, recognized as such by not just black people, but white people. Nat Turner was smart. And he knew he was smart. And you might ask, what does that have to do with anything? It's because, as one of the historians wrote, there was a huge chasm between what Nat Turner was, a slave, and what he aspired to be. He had dreams. He had hopes. They were actually, if he were white, they were realistic. He was a smart fellow.
Yeah.
And so part of the rebellion was an expression of outrage that because of this fluke of fortune, he was born with a black skin and he had no possibility, none. We're talking about 1831, long before the Civil War. No possibility whatsoever except to be born into, languish in, and die a slave. And it was the rebellion, or his leadership of it, was an expression of outrage at this condition that he had been born into. And I think, I can't prove it. Nobody will probably ever know. But in my opinion, it was the same thing with Hamas on October 7th. Part of it was just the throw of the dice. We've tried everything. It hasn't worked. It looks like there's going to be this deal with Saudi Arabia. Saudis are going to join the Abraham Accords, and we'll just be forgotten. We'll be like a game preserve. Just left, a burial ground, an elephant burial ground. We're going to just be left here to die until we disappear. And it was a throw of the dice. Let's do this and see what happens. There's a famous line attributed to Napoleon, on s'engage, puis on voit. You're Lebanese, so you know.
I unfortunately do not speak French.
Oh, it means on s'engage, you jump in and see what happens. On s'engage, puis on voit, and then one sees. I think a lot of it was just that. It was a throw of the dice. I think there was a significant element of revenge. And a part of it was, I think those were the two main elements, but we'll really never know. I don't even think they knew quite what they were doing. They didn't, it's pretty clear, they didn't inform Hezbollah of their plan. They didn't inform Iran of their plan. I think it was an act of desperation and an element of hope that maybe we'll create a crisis and who knows what will come of it. Was it doomed to fail? Yes. Because when you're dealing with such formidable powers like Israel and the United States, or Israel backed by the United States, when you're dealing with such formidable powers, it takes a lot of patient planning, organizing. It can't be just a throw of the dice. It has to be much more carefully planned.
Mm-hmm. To start to wrap up, I want to ask you about Israel's eventual endgame, for a lack of better term. Mm-hmm. They've made Gaza virtually uninhabitable. They have
It's uninhabitable.
It's uninhabitable.
The estimate is, as of July, 63% of the infrastructure was destroyed. Now it must be 70%. So just imagine if you're walking down a city block, say of Manhattan, and 7 of every 10 buildings is destroyed. That's Gaza. There's nothing left.
Uninhabitable. So they've made Gaza uninhabitable. They've attempted a ground invasion in Lebanon. And
they didn't attempt a ground invasion. They were not able to do it.
Well,
they talked about it.
They discussed a ground invasion.
But there was never a ground because they knew the Hezbollah, there would be a lot of settling of scores, especially after the killing of Nasrallah. So they talked about what there was a lot of destruction in Lebanon.
And now they've seized territory in Syria. So what is the end goal here?
The end goal is, look, I think this is the third great turning point in the Arab world. There was 48, there was 67, and now there's this. There's a there's a major political reshuffling of the balance of forces in the region. I think probably the most likely next thing that's going to happen is Iran's going to get the bomb. Because it sees that it's been cornered, and without a nuclear deterrent, it's next in line. It's next in line. So I'm sure they're rushing now to get the bomb, to get nuclear weapons. It's I have two feelings. One, of course, there's every grounds to be despondent, despairing, hopeless. On the other hand, there was a lot of rot in the Arab world, and it's always better when the rot comes to the surface, so you can clear it away and start from the beginning again. Start from scratch, learn the lessons. But if it was rotten, and there was a lot of rot, the Syrian government was a nightmare. There can't be any dispute about that. But there was a lot of rot, then it's for the better. Where we go from here, I don't know. I won't live to see anything positive.
Is their goal to just seize more territory? Or
no, I don't think they're much.
Where does it lie?
I don't think they much care about territory. I think that's all, I think that's all. They want regional domination. They want to they want to control the region, but they don't have any particular land aspirations, because it's just going to be a pain. It's going to be a pain for them to try. There's going to be there's going to be what they call irredentist. Irredentist means when you quarrel over territory. There are going to be all of these irredentist demands now with the Syrians, and it's just going to become it complicates matters for them. So I don't think they particularly want to encroach on Syrian territory with all the headaches. They just want to control, like what they did. They blew up everything in Syria, any weapons. So Syria won't pose any military threat to them, which is what they want. But to actually annex the territory, no, I don't believe so.
Thank you so much to our viewers. Please stay tuned. We have a lot of new interviews coming up soon. And you can find the written version of this on Columbia Political Review's website. Thank you.